Welcome back to Session 5, Respond to Conditioning Extinction. In this section, we will finish up the topic of responsive behavior by discussing John Watson, his contribution to the field of behavior analysis, and in particular to the philosophy of behaviorism. We'll also be discussing a couple of the therapies that came out of responsive conditioning and extinction procedures, and we'll go through a couple of real-life examples of responsive conditioning in action in the world around us. I'm going to go ahead and freeze the camera here, and please make sure you have your PowerPoint presentations ready to go. Okay, let me turn on my pointer. Let's see if we can get this working. There we go. And let's go ahead and get started. This is a picture of Watson. Watson contributed a great deal to the field of behavior analysis, and in particular, he was one of the ones who started bringing the philosophy and the research of Pavlov into the United States and applying it to discuss topics in psychology. He was said to start the movement of behaviorism in psychology. In particular, what he did was to actually put forward the claim that the subject matter for psychology should be behavior and nothing but behavior. That is, dealing only with observable and measurable things, and that which is not observable or measurable is not really a subject matter for psychology. He was one of the first behaviorists, quote-unquote behaviorists, who was elected as president of the American Psychological Association. Now, since his time, obviously, there have been many, many presidents in the APA. And in particular, there were some presidents who actually had their first beginning in the field of psychopathology, in the field of behavioral therapy. A lot of the work that Watson did, and not only was he well known for his work with obviously Little Albert, which you could certainly read about in the psychology textbooks, but he was also a very meticulous researcher working with animal research, in particular studying some of the same sorts of things that Darwin was studying in terms of the evolution of certain morphological structures in terns, for example, birds that were in the dry tortugas areas in the Everglades of Florida. Some of the clinical approaches that actually come out of responsive conditioning are very well known, one of them being systematic desensitization, in which a person may have a fear or phobia that develops into such full-blown pathology that at first the fear may actually begin as a rational fear that many people have, but through the process of responsive conditioning and some of the various pairings of neutral stimuli that were present temporarily, or at least in terms of contingencies, very close to the actual unconditional stimulus. And what happens is that after a period of time, they may actually exert control over behavior. For example, one common unconditional stimulus that people have is if you put your finger down your throat, you could have an unconditional response of throwing up. So if you do this again and again, you have your unconditional stimulus, finger and throat, unconditional response, throwing up, and you do these enough times, then if you do this behavior in specific settings, it could be that some of the properties of those settings now begin to exert control, and you begin to feel perhaps a little bit of nausea even before you put your finger down your throat. Now, these could be things such as, well, if you go into a particular bathroom that has all kinds of olfactory stimuli present, certain kinds of visual stimuli present, and you do this enough times, then that particular area will evoke some of those responses, and you find that the person no longer has to put their finger down their throat. They could just walk into the stall and then start engaging or seemingly engage in some of the responses that are involved in throwing up. Now, what ends up happening here is that these fears could start backing up. For example, now all of a sudden it's the bathroom stall that evokes some of the responses. It could be that going towards that bathroom may evoke some of the responses. It could be wherever that bathroom is located, that building may evoke some of those responses. And then what you have, therefore, is a full-blown fear that you're not even coming close to the bathroom in general, and you're starting to come away with these nauseating feelings. And this is sometimes how these fears may actually develop. If you have a fear of a snake, for example, obviously the unconditional stimulus in that situation might be getting bit by the snake, and then the unconditional response is whatever actually happens when you get a snake bite. But over a period of time, things which become resembling a snake might actually become fearful. Probably many of you remember some of the scenes in Raiders of the Lost Ark with Indiana Jones, and he developed the irrational fear of snakes, and you didn't know really where it came from. You just knew that he was afraid of snakes in the first movie. But in the third movie, what is it? The Last Crusade, you see a very young Indiana Jones, and you have a visual image of at the very beginning of the film where he first encountered the snakes in an enclosed kind of, I think it was a circus train, and he fell into the reptile tank or something like that. So it's implied by that was the origin of him developing this irrational fear of snakes. Okay. Well, what you do then with systematic desensitization is that you sit down with a person, you go and you develop this list of all of the fears, going from the most fearful, which might be getting bitten by a snake, to maybe the least fearful. You start getting freaked out if you look at a garden hose and you say, "Boy, that looks like a snake," and you start screaming and you jump on top of the patio chair, and somebody comes out of the patio and says, "What are you screaming about?" And you say, "I'm afraid of snakes, and that garden hose looks like a snake." And they come and cart you away. They say you need some systematic desensitization because that's a very irrational fear. So you might actually start off with that garden snake and reestablish that, which has become a full-blown aversive kind of conditional stimulus through this process. And you may actually talk about garden hoses. You may look at pictures of garden hoses. Somebody may take you to Home Depot or Lowe's, and you may go up and down the aisles, and at a distance you see those nasty garden hoses, and you say, "Oh, I'm getting afraid." You may stop right there. You may do some systematic desensitization or some breathing. You may turn away. You might clear your mind, so to speak, and then turn around again, and all of a sudden you feel a little bit more comfortable in front of those garden hoses, and then you might take a step forward. You might check out the prices. You might compare one with another. And before too much longer, you could handle garden snakes again, or I should say garden hoses. Garden snakes are another matter. But anyway, you work your way up this hierarchy, fearful than anything else, which is that snake. Flooding and implosion are very, very similar kinds of approaches. These are also considered what we call types of exposure therapies, in which the individual is exposed to the stimuli which evoke fears and phobias and all those kinds of respondents. Your heart rate goes up, you start sweating, and so on. Your blood pressure starts increasing. All of these wonderful autonomic nervous system things that we experience when we are exposed to things which are quote unquote fearful. In flooding, you are exposed directly to those things. So going back to the snake example, you might actually be in a room with snakes that are maybe in a tank. Rather than working your way up to a garden hose, you're going to go right for the one of the most fear-evoking stimuli, and that would be again flooding, exposure to this for a period of time, and until your fears and phobias go away. And implosive therapy is basically a variation on the same theme, except here what you might do is be exposed to the most fearful condition you possibly could, and that might get rid of your fear. So over here, if you're just being exposed to seeing snakes in a tank, over here you might actually be in a room filled with venomous snakes, sort of like Indiana Jones was when he was plopped into the Tomb of the Lost Souls, I think, is where the Ark was residing in Cairo or wherever it was located. That was a little bit of implosive therapy for Indiana Jones. And then finally, aversive therapy. Here, the idea is that if you have a behavior that you engage in that is not fearful, but is something that is pathological, and you want to, and it becomes in your best interest behavior, and pairing it with aversive kinds of stimuli. This was the theme, by the way, if anybody remembers either the book or the movie Clockwork Orange, which was supposedly the application of behavior therapy principles to change socially deviant behavior. Certainly, you could go ahead and I think that movie is readily available on Netflix. I won't say any more. Go ahead and check it out. You could kind of see the use of aversive therapy. By the way, in that movie, they were probably making the case that aversive therapy didn't work, but anybody would have actually been able to see that the therapy would have been a failure because after a period of time, you have to expose the person to some of those aversive events again. Otherwise, the behavior will undergo extinction, and you're right back where you started. Okay. Okay, let's move on. So let's talk a little bit about then the adaptive significance. We talked about the adaptive significance of respondent behavior before, but now we're going to talk about why would conditioning have come about. Well, you could well imagine that what we're talking about here are a lot of pre-wired behaviors that we have evolved as a species to engage in over a period of time. And the thing that happens with respondent conditioning is that it allows for the modifiability of this process of respondent behavior. In other words, imagine if you had to wait an extended period of time for you to actually adapt a response to venomous snakes. That is, you'd have to, over a period of time, be exposed to it again and again, and perhaps maybe after you were exposed to it and people around you were exposed to being bitten by snakes, there will come a time in which these snakes actually have no effect on your behavior. In other words, morphology has kicked in, and you are now, for all sakes and purposes, immune. But that could take a very long time for something like that to happen. So through this process, we could actually recognize fearful stimuli that will exert control. For example, rather than having been bitten by a snake, the rattle on a tail actually, through respondent conditioning, that sound could evoke a type of a conditioned response in which you don't have to be exposed to a snake bite. The rattle in and of itself will evoke enough behavior, emotional behavior, where you will turn away from those kinds of stimuli. So again, respondent conditioning is a very, very adaptive kind of process, although in many cases you can see instances where respondent conditioning does get way out of control. Like I said, fears and phobias are oftentimes the exception to the rules, but it is in a very adaptive process by which we just simply learn there are certain types of stimuli that we should stay away from, and rather than actually having to ingest it and first be exposed to it, it's the stimuli that are correlated with it. This is why, rather than having to learn again and again eating bad foods, certain things evoke the fact that they're spoiled, maybe the smell of it and so on. Certainly, the smell of certain kinds of alcohol have an effect on my behavior. The smell of bourbon, scotch, and whiskey and tequila. Through that, one trial sort of learning I went through, I won't really go near the stuff. It starts evoking a lot of those feelings in my stomach that I usually get right before I start getting sick. Now, for me, that's probably a good thing. All right, well, let's go ahead and finish up here and go through some examples of respondent conditioning and some of the cultural practices that we actually see with respondent conditioning. Now, first and foremost at the top of the list is religious experiences, events, and holidays, which are rich in all kinds of things that evoke emotions during these times of the year. Right now, it's just getting ready for Christmas time and Hanukkah time and all the things that go into those events. The change of the season certainly marks the event. The whole idea of peace on earth and goodwill towards men is certainly paired with many of the things in our environments that we oftentimes see. We also oftentimes see, I certainly know that in my religion, the Jewish religion, when we were very, very little, one of the things that we used to have to do is they would march us up. It was probably when we were about 6 or 7 years old, and they would stretch out this Torah on the stand in front of the rabbi, and it wasn't really the official good Torah. This is the knockaround Torah. It's the one that was used for kids to teach them certain things about religion. And one of the things that they used to have us do is they had us line up, and the rabbi would call us one at a time to walk up, and he would take a little dropper an eyedropper, and take a little drop of honey and put it right on the page of the Torah. And then, of course, the rabbi would read from the Torah, and then he would turn to you and he would give you the cue with his finger. And what you were supposed to do was go up and take your finger and wipe the honey off of the page of the Torah. It's just a little drop. And you're supposed to, after you take the honey drop on your finger, put it to your tongue, taste it, and then off you go. Walk off, and then the next student would come up. And then the rabbi would read a little bit more. He'd put a little bit more honey on the page. And you'd do this again. You would go ahead and touch the page with your fingers and touch it against your tongue and go, honey. And then off you go, and then the next person would come up. Now, one of the reasons why they do this is because they are trying to pair the taste of honey with the words of the Lord. They say that the words of the Lord are sweet. And of course, honey is sweet, and they're going ahead. And this is a very conspicuous form of pairing a sweet food with this other thing called the words of the Lord. And also, by the way, that's an operant response. This is that by putting your fingers to the page of the Torah, then putting it up towards your mouth, is very close to what you're supposed to do when you walk into the home, in which there's a mezuzah posted on the door of the house, and you're supposed to walk through the door and put your fingers on the mezuzah and then put it to your mouth, because those are the words of the Lord, and so forth and so on. Now, of course, even at 7 years old, I knew what was going on here. I knew that this was obvious respondent conditioning going on, but I went along with it anyway, just to experience the whole event. So here again is a fairly good example of using respondent conditioning with pairing religious events. Here we also see respondent conditioning happening in doctor's office and dentist's office. And certainly you could make a long list of all of those things that are in doctor's office and dentist's offices that you're exposed to, that the minute you smell those things or experiencing those things, you say, oh my gosh. And certainly kids are aware of this. You go into a dentist's office, it's that used to be, at least when I was growing up in the 60s, there was a very antiseptic smell to it. There was the sound of the drill. There was, nowadays they squirt water in your mouth, but they used to have this wash basin right by your chair, and they would squirt water in your mouth. You had to spit it into the wash basin. There are things such as textures. For example, a good buddy of mine, behavior analyst, used to say this used to bug him. When he'd go to the doctor's office, when you're sitting on the doctor's table to be examined, that wax paper that's on there, he used to tell his class and tell me that wax paper today just completely sends him off the deep edge. That is, the minute he sits on and comes in contact with it, he gets that creepy feeling. And that's what actually happens when you're a little kid. You're sitting there, you're getting the doctor is examining you. All of those stimuli become pretty fear-evoking. The smell of alcohol, the tongue depressor that goes onto your mouth, all of those things carry properties. For me, it actually happened even before I even got to see the dentist. Sitting in the dentist's or in the doctor's waiting room when I was a kid, holy boats, that used to scare me. It was always a room that you didn't know what was going on behind the door. And when you actually used to ring to, my mother used to push the button to tell the nurse or the receptionist that I was there. You pushed the button, it was this distinct sound, and then you had to wait. And then you heard this glass that grinds when you actually open it up, and that sound used to, right there, evoke all kinds of fears and phobias. Highlight magazines today still kind of give me the creeps, because that's the only thing that was available to read in doctor's offices. So you can come up with your own list of all of those things, the fears and phobias that people go through. Commercials and the media, boy, they take all kinds of advantages of respondent conditioning that people, that certainly have experienced and evoke some of those emotional responses. For example, back when I was growing up, there used to be a commercial for Lipton iced tea. And what they used to show you is an instance in which this guy who's in these Bermuda shorts has this manual lawnmower, and it seems like he's mowing 30 or 40 acres of grass, which comprises his backyard, and he's obviously working up a sweat. And as he's working up a sweat, his wife brings him out Lipton iced tea, and he goes and starts drinking it. And from the first moment that the moisture of the liquid crosses his tongue, all of a sudden the picture switches to that same gentleman in those same dorky Bermuda shorts, now literally falling backwards slowly in slow motion into a swimming pool. And then the scene switches that he drinks a little bit more of the iced tea. And as the iced tea glass goes up and up, showing that he's drinking more and more, the scene constantly switches back and forth to him falling further and further back into a pool. And of course, this whole thing is supposed to evoke the idea that drinking Lipton iced tea is sort of like being on a hot day and falling into a swimming pool. So much so that you don't even want to drink the stuff, but you want to buy the stuff anyway because you've been hot before, and darn, you could surely use a nice dip in a pool. Now, we use the same sort of thing if you've watched some of the Coors commercial, the Silver Bullet. It's the same principle. They're doing the same thing. Everybody's burning up in a desert or something like that, and all of a sudden, in comes this express that all of a sudden brings everything down to a subarctic chill. And so, again, they're all using the same sorts of things that will evoke the idea that we've all experienced heat. We all know what it feels like, the pleasure we get of exposing our body to something cool on a hot day, and now they are simply using those kinds of stimuli to evoke the same thing. Same thing holds true with odors and tastes and sounds and scenes, that certainly a certain odor you may experience may immediately evoke a certain kind of response that you had, something that you've eaten before, something that sort of reminds you of an experience that you had before, something that you've tasted that you haven't had in years. It may be your grandmother's apple pie or something along those lines. My grandmother used to make these outrageously delicious flat onion pretzels that I certainly have the recipe for. I think I'm the only one in the family that has it, but I'm the only one who makes it. And when out of the goodness of my heart, when I'm in a good mood, I'll send some to my cousins, and I'll get a phone call saying, boy, does that bring back memories, because they haven't had it in years, and it's a very unique taste that was experienced in a very unique set of conditions, usually at my grandmother's house. Sounds that evoke certain kinds of those sorts of things as well. And certain sounds will evoke certain types of fears. And again, these are the things that really come into play when we're talking about people who have PTSD. If you talk to people who are coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, and they talk about some of their fears and phobias and how they're actually couched in terms of when they're walking down the street and they're in their hometown, all they have to do is see a car that's still running, and they immediately get that evoked response. If they're walking along and they just see randomly a wire coming out of a wall, it immediately triggers all kinds of autonomic sympathetic nervous systems kinds of responses. Very interesting that these are the things that come into play that we're talking about here, all through responsive conditioning. Taste aversions also are one of those sorts of things that you have a novel kind of food that you eat, and because the taste is so novel, when you get sick, you attribute it to the novel taste. And let's see how this might work. Let's say, for example, and I apologize for using this example to all of you vegetarians out there, but it will make the point clear. If you're the kind of person who likes occasionally eating steak, and you also enjoy eating smothered in mushrooms and onions and those sorts of things, and you've eaten this 20, 30 times in your life, 40 times in your life, and enjoyed every single time, but then on one occasion you go to somebody's house and they tell you, here's some mushrooms and onions you could put on your steak. And the person also invites you to try something, Béarnaise sauce, which you've never tasted before. They say, you've never tasted Béarnaise? Well, here, try just a little bit on your steak. And of course, you try it, and it immediately you say, boy, that tastes great. That's delicious. I can't believe what I've been missing all of my life. Now, at the same time you're eating that Béarnaise sauce for the first time, you're also eating mushrooms and onions smothered on the steak, which you've eaten many, many times. And unbeknownst to you, it turns out that the mushrooms that were used had gone past their time, and they were bad. And you eat this meal and you go home that night and you get incredibly sick to your stomach. Now, it turns out that when it comes up again and you say to yourself, I will never eat Béarnaise sauce, Even though the Béarnaise sauce really had nothing to do with it, it's that unique taste that is paired with the mushroom. And of course, because again, how many trials did you have of mushrooms? No problems. Many. How many times did you eat Béarnaise sauce and had problems? Just this one time. Funny how things work. And you go back and you think about some of your own taste aversions. Take this in consideration that it may be that the thing that you have a taste aversion to really did not actually get you sick. It may have been something completely different. And this is one of those instances where you had this one trial learning and now you're going to get sick and never try it again. Okay? All right. And by the way, this is one of those things that drives my family members crazy. I don't eat meatloaf. I can't stand meatloaf. My mother made categorically the worst meatloaf that I've ever had in my life and was forced to eat this as a kid. So now when people say, "Oh, you got to try this meatloaf. You'll love it." I have a really bad taste aversion to all meatloaf, and much to my wife's dismay, she will never get me to eat this stuff, nor will my family. What about hallucinations and flashbacks? Here again, you have these instances in which, under certain circumstances, physiologically, you're predisposed to possibly have a hallucination or a flashback from these pairing operations. There are times in which you may suffer a very, very high fever, and under those conditions, you may have experiences which, through that high fever and nausea and vomiting, you're exposed to certain things, and now you go back and you watch those things, and it sets the occasion for those same things happening again. They evoke the same kind of type of nausea. And you could get this possibly through hallucinations. Okay, what else do we got here? Hollywood and Disney theme parks. That is, when you think about going to Disney World, there are a lot of rides that you experience there, roller coasters and all kinds of things. And many of the things that we experience there, some of the odors, the smells, the sounds, the taste, all those things that go into those autonomic nervous system responses on those rides. Now, actually, you could go through the conditioning process. There are some kids who literally, just even approaching the Disney World park, their heart starts pounding. They're already starting to experience some of those things and those feelings, and can't wait to get on those rides. Incidental music, neutral sounds that actually, through pairing operations, through movies, now evoke those sounds. They become cultural markers, if you think about it. For example, if you've ever seen the movie Psycho, and you know the scene, the famous shower scene, and the violins and the music that go along with that. Now, of course, because those violins in that unique set of circumstances evoke that fear response of a person getting stabbed in a shower, it now has a place in our culture. That is, whenever you're going to see anything that might be kind of scary, even if it's a parody of something that's going to be scary, they automatically put in those violins to prepare you for either something that's going to be scary, or you get the joke that this should be really scary, and all of a sudden it's not really that scary. That's the joke. The same thing holds true with the music of Jaws. That is, you all know the music before the shark is about to attack. It starts off slow, and then the rhythm starts increasing, the pace starts increasing, and as the animal gets closer and closer, the music gets faster and faster until all of a sudden the shark strikes. That too has a place in our culture, that whenever something is about to be attacked, you hear that shark music, incidental music. And again, this is not the very first time that incidental music has been used, certainly not in movies. It had been used in plays, in Shakespeare's time. Stravinsky made a great deal of this use of this music. Mendelssohn, many of the other great composers used incidental music. And it's so interesting because if you go back to some of these movies, I invite you to do this sometime. Watch the movie, but get rid of the sound. Get rid of the music. And in a lot of movies, you'll find that it's the music that really sort of makes it really creepy and scary. Okay? Think of all the scary movies like Friday the 13th and Halloween and all those movies that have that music in it. Oh, here's a good one to think about here, the movie The Shining. Music played a big part in that particular movie. Take the music out, the movie doesn't really have the same impact at a lot of times. By the way, that's one of the really big sells of home theater at 7.1 sound. It's not just the visual image of high definition. It's really the sound system that makes the difference. Okay? All right. And then finally, in many instances that we talk about, respond to conditioning, for example, PTSD, fears and phobias, all the things that go on to respond to conditioning, we're talking about behaviors that we may have that we want to get rid of, fears and phobias that we want to get rid of. But the same thing actually works in reverse. And we could use respond to conditioning to perhaps make better use of the things that we pair with happy events so that when we're not feeling that great or we want to evoke happy feelings, we could do so through the same procedures. That is, these are songs and important environmental events that are paired with these important events. For example, with weddings, we may want to hang on to things which evoke those feelings. People hold on to their wedding dresses, they hold on to maybe ashtrays. It is tradition to hold on to I think it's the top of the cake for one full year, although most of the people do that. I don't know if they ever eat that stuff, but they usually take it and put it in their freezer for 1 year and celebrate on their first year. We also try to evoke some of those same feelings that strengthen marriages and relationships by having anniversaries. The anniversary is just a year marker, which hopefully on the anniversary we have that one time that we go out, we have a good time, we forget all of our troubles, and we try to strike up that romantic feeling. If we can't do it all year round, at least we try to do it maybe once a year. When people go and want to go away for their 5th anniversary or their 10th anniversary, many times they'll try to go back to the same sort of place where they had their honeymoon. In other words, going on a second honeymoon is very popular. In fact, there are some doctors who oftentimes recommend this to say to kind of get back to getting some of the feelings that evoked that feel of passion when you first were married. Go back to the place you were married to before, and they'll try to go back to the same hotel, maybe try to get the same hotel room. If you were my father, you would have tried to argue, see if you could get the same hotel rate, and that certainly would have made his second honeymoon, I'm sure. And these are the things that we try to do. We try to set these things up to evoke happier situations and happier times. It is good that we take videos and use our iPhones often to take pictures. And nowadays, the wonderful thing I think about photography is that at the moment's notice, we don't have to go find our camera. We could literally break out a camera, freeze the moment, and we have so much room to store these images. This is a great thing because we could always go back and see things that evoke some of the great times that we had when we were with our parents who might have already passed away. My parents have, but now I certainly go back and look at some of those videos. These are things, by the way, that you really don't think about when your parents are alive, I have to tell you. You tend to say, yeah, they're there, we'll keep them in storage and stuff like that. But all of a sudden, when the real evoking stimuli have passed away, my parents have, it is comforting, literally comforting, to go up and look through some of those pictures, to look at some of my father's medals from World War II, read some of the stories, short stories that my mother used to write, even sort of look back at some of their events of their calendars that they used to keep track of, the things that they do all year round. And I'd read through there and say, don't forget to, get your son Jeff and your son Richard a birthday card and get them a present and so forth and so on. It really is comforting to have some of these stimuli around. So in these instances, respond to conditioning could be your worst enemy and make stimuli so irrationally fearful. At the same time, respond to conditioning could take some of the most simple pleasures in our lives that evoke wonderful feelings and bring them up many, many notches because the stimuli immediately bring you back to that place and that feeling that you had. All right, I'm going to stop here because we got lots to talk about with operant conditioning and operant behavior coming up in